Thank you for joining us. Our webinar will be beginning shortly. Thank you all for joining us. Our webinar will be beginning shortly. I want to take a moment just to introduce some of the upcoming webinars that we have this month. On February 11th at 12 p.m. Pacific, our NIOSH ERC Industrial Hygiene webinar, Exposures to Viruses Among Healthcare Workers by Dr. Rachel Jones. And on February 19th is our next ERC Ergonomics webinar, Using Anthropometry, Biomechanics, and Usability to Inform Product Design by Dr. Pete Johnson. For more webinars and courses, visit COEH at berkeley.edu/aboutCE. Thank you for joining us. Our webinar will be beginning shortly. Welcome. On behalf of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, I would like to welcome you to our webinar, Our Soil, Ourselves, How Your Health Connects to Soil by Dr. Daphne Miller. This webinar is being co-hosted by our partners at Be Well at Work. A few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online chat or Q&A. We will save time at the end of the presentation to address all questions. When you exit the webinar, a link to the evaluation will become available in your browser. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link to the evaluation tomorrow. Attendees who have participated in the complete live webinar today with an attentiveness score of 85% or higher will be eligible to receive a certificate of completion. Attentiveness scores are calculated by your webinar provider and are based on continuous engagement throughout the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page and on our website, coeh.berkeley.edu. At this time, we are pleased to present Dr. Daphne Miller. Dr. Miller is the founder of Health from the Soil Up initiative that seeks to catalyze collaboration and innovative thinking at the nexus of soil health and human health. She is a clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and a project scientist at the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health at UC Berkeley. Dr. Miller's research explores ways to integrate human health and ecosystem health. She is an advisor and consultant to a number of organizations that address health and sustainability, and is also a contributing health columnist to the Washington Post. Her books include Farmacology, Health from the Soil Up, and The Jungle Effect. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Miller.
Hello and welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much, Center for Occupational and Environmental Health and Campus Wellness, for inviting me. I think we're a pretty diverse group that's collected for this noontime talk. From what I understand, there's researchers and people who are working in industrial hygiene, and also people who are working more in clinical medicine, and then folks who are just interested in their own wellness. So I hope that the language that I'm using and the science that I'm using for this hour really is accessible to everybody. And if I do say things that are unclear, I hope you ask questions. So thanks so much for joining. And this is an exciting time, I feel, in health in general, both in terms of our personal health and public health. We really are starting to think much more broadly than disease and preventing, or treating disease, and really starting to think about how the environment writ large impacts our health. And so hopefully this will contribute to that vein of thinking. So just to get started, I just wanted to introduce you a little bit to who I am and why I'm doing this work, because it's somewhat unusual to have a physician. And by the way, I still see patients 2 days a week at UCSF. But it's pretty unusual to have a physician who is working in soil for part of her career and in agriculture. And I really do spend part of my work week, talking with people in agroecology and agronomy, and spending time on farms and so on. And I think in many ways it goes back a couple decades, more than a couple decades, to when I was an intern in Salinas at Natividad Medical Center, working on the wards and taking care of patients. And as I was doing this work, I started to really pay attention to where I was geographically on the globe, in that I was working in the lettuce basket of the United States, and one of the most fertile spots in the world, which is, as you all know, sort of the Salinas Valley. This region is where we pump out the fruits and vegetables for much of the country, and actually export them all over the world. And if it weren't for this region in the US, we certainly wouldn't have a lot of the lettuces that we have around the United States, or cilantro, or carrots, or strawberries, and so on, asparagus, artichokes. But as I was working at the medical center, it started to dawn on me how much agriculture was impacting the health of my patients. And most of that was quite negative. I mean, I was seeing patients coming into the emergency room with organophosphate poisoning. I was seeing migrant farm workers who had been injured sometimes very seriously by farm equipment or by unfair labor laws. I was seeing the poverty and inequity that was caused by the exploitation in agriculture. And I was also seeing patients who sort of indirectly had been harmed by agriculture, who had type 2 diabetes and so on, and from not being able to have access to more expensive fruits and vegetables, and having to eat highly processed food. So this entire experience started me thinking, if agriculture can harm us so severely, are there ways that we can flip this on its head? And what is a system of agriculture? What is a system of growing food that actually can promote health and protect us and keep us healthy? And this was something that I was asking my medical professors and starting to do research on, and looking in the health literature and finding that there was very little discussion that connected health and health promotion and protection with agriculture. All of the discussion was about disease, about the pathogens in the soil, about the pesticides that were injuring us, and exposures both through water and air, but very little public health discussion about what it is like to build a healthy farming system from the ground up. And so I really had to kind of go back and do my own education in agriculture to really start to envision what would it be like to create healthy soil and healthy farms that would protect us. And I am going to give you sort of a brief history of agriculture and disease, to catch you up to this idea. But basically, we are in this very critical place in history right now where many more of us across the globe are dying from non-communicable diseases than we are from infectious disease. In fact, when you look around the world, really one of the number one diseases that is most likely to sort of be one of the top causes of death in the coming several decades is diabetes and associated illnesses from diabetes. I mean, if all of us with diabetes were to go and create our own country, we would be the third largest country in the world, per se. So diabetes is really an enormous international, public health threat. And not just diabetes, but if you look at what's happening with other non-infectious diseases, autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, these are also increasing in incidence, interestingly, in sort of mirror image as infectious diseases are disappearing around the globe. And one can argue that there is an interconnection there. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But for the purpose of this talk, I am actually proposing that we look at these disease trends, and in fact, a lot of them we can trace back to the history of how we have treated our soil and our farms and what has happened in agriculture throughout history. Agriculture started about 10,000 years ago. That's when we really started to tame the soil and really exploit the soil through a whole series of activities, including plowing and sowing and growing. And we did this in various places around the globe. And this was really considered the first agricultural revolution. And during this time, we took wild seeds like these grasses that you see over on the left, and we selected for ones that had a little bit more protein and were a little bit more palatable. And we selected for these seeds and we started to grow them in a more organized way. And we were actually able to start to nourish communities and turn this into foods that were edible, and actually even start to store these foods. These were the first granaries that really were the equivalent of our sort of modern day supermarkets. And by being able to grow and select for more nutritious seeds and store these seeds, suddenly civilizations were able to flourish and people were able to specialize themselves. You didn't have to just be a farmer anymore. You could be an artist or a mathematician or a king or queen or a politician or what have you. There was room for differentiation in society. Then fast forward, to the sort of 15th through 17th century, all of a sudden we started to have the second agricultural revolution, which really was this idea of using seed more at scale and really hybridizing. I was using the tulips, the Dutch tulips as an example. That's something we're all very familiar with, all those fascinating breeds of tulips they were able to develop. But we did this with all kinds of fruits and vegetables and all kinds of grains, and really started to optimize for being able to grow specialty crops at large scales, and really have relatively few people grow our food and lots of other people doing other things in society. This really exploded during the third agricultural revolution, which came out of the First and Second World Wars. And that was when we were able to take all these great inventions that happened during those wars that were actually using fossil fuels and turning them into things like explosives and chemical warfare. I'm being a little sarcastic when I'm calling them great inventions, by the way. But we were able to take those inventions, tanks, and turn them into agricultural innovation. So the chemical warfare all of a sudden became pesticides and herbicides, and the explosives became chemical fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizer, and the tanks became tractors. And all of a sudden we had this unbelievably efficient system of growing food where our yields were able to really explode and bring a lot of communities out of poverty and out of starvation. And that really set the scene for being able to produce all these calories per day around the globe of a very small portfolio of foods. So these are really the top 7 foods that are produced around the globe, along with cotton, which is a fiber. And at the same time, we were able to, really specialize these seeds that worked very well with herbicides and pesticides. And, just this shows you from the 1970s to 2010, our #1 crop on this planet, which is rice, how it basically was able to double in yield. And we were able to do this with wheat and sugar and corn and so on. So just growing unbelievable amounts of food. And that really does bring you to what we call the modern day diet, which is a diet that's heavily reliant on these very processed foods, and that we really can kind of come the full circle back to that epidemic of obesity and other non-infectious diseases that I talked about a couple minutes ago. And these are now our modern granaries, the insides of supermarkets, where basically you have these 7 ingredients in all these different forms. If you go and look at the ingredients of most of what you see in the middle of the supermarkets, they really are made up of those 7 items in different combinations and with different labels. This modern form of agriculture is making us sick, not just through our food, but also through the byproducts of what we are doing in order to grow that food. So this is a industrial fertilizer plant in Mississippi, which is actually spewing out waste in the form of methane and so on into the atmosphere. It is also polluting the river. And I'm sure you have heard of Cancer Alley, which is these 80 acres along the Mississippi where a lot of these fertilizer plants exist. And it has some of the highest rates of cancer in the world, and certainly in the United States. Here we are in California. This is from the most recent CalEnviroscreen, and the dark blue area are the areas that have the highest concentration of poisonous nitrates in the water, making the water undrinkable. And if you look very carefully, that really overlays with our most intense industrial agricultural zones. And so what we're having are these parts of California where literally the water is unsafe for drinking as a result of the chemical fertilizers that we're using. Within our concentrated agriculture, this is a photograph from a farm that I visited in the Central Valley that is producing milk. These cows are often fed antibiotics when they have infections in their udders and in their uteri. And what we're finding is that the use of antibiotics in our agricultural system is 40 times higher than the use of antibiotics in our medical system. And so this antibiotic use is translating into antibiotic resistance when in humans. And this is also a big public health issue where when we most need these antibiotics, they are no longer working for us. Agriculture is also important and contributor both to greenhouse gases in the form of CO2 emissions, but also in the form of what we're calling short-lived climate pollutants like methane and carbon monoxide and so on. So these are also very important issues. As we're seeing an increase in greenhouse gases on the planet, we're also seeing a loss of diversity of all types of species on the planet. And as I will get to, this loss of diversity is also impacting our health. So finally, treatment of the soil itself. One could argue that we have been damaging the Earth's soils ever since we first started doing a more organized form of agriculture 10,000 years ago. And that has been with this very simple instrument called a plow, which we all have thought of as this kind of benign thing to do to plow the soil. I mean, we've done this for centuries and centuries and centuries. But it turns out when you plow the soil, you're losing that very fragile level of topsoil. And that is a critically important piece for keeping our land healthy. As we have plowed soil for centuries, civilizations have failed because they've in fact lost their nourishment through the soil. This is a map which shows how water erosion has looked around the globe and how soil erosion has looked. And you can see that we're swiftly losing our topsoil around the globe. This is what the loss of topsoil looks like right now in the Central Valley and places where we are growing only one crop and using way too much water. The soil is literally washing away towards Southern California. This is a photo that I took last summer. And this is what a loss of topsoil looks like too, where we are losing our nutrients as we are mistreating our soil. We are losing the nutrients in our food. And this is directly translated into yield. We have this idea that we're supposed to be using all these fertilizers and chemicals so that we can quote unquote feed the planet. But if you look here, as a result of mistreating our soil, we actually have plateaued in our yield around the world and are not really producing any more bushels per acre than we have for the past couple decades. And this is also translated into loss of income for farmers. If you look at the adjusted prices for corn, wheat, and soy, our three biggest crops, they've actually gone down per bushel. And this is a huge problem in terms of income for farmers and allowing them to be viable. And things are really at such a crisis point in terms of soil loss and productivity and pollution of the planet that the Secretary General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has come forward and said, we need to promote transformative changes in the way we consume and produce food. We need to put forward sustainable systems to offer healthy and nutritious food and preserve the environment. So this leads us to really what is the fourth revolution. And this is really the soil health revolution, where we are aligning what the needs of our bodies are and the needs of the planet. And this is what I'm so excited to talk about in the last part, in the remainder of this talk. And I have this photo of me going out to visit farms, because it really is this fourth revolution that I'm interested in, and that I've really been doing my own education to try and understand. And what it is really a growing group of farmers who are farming in what is called this regenerative way that is good for the planet, good for the farmer in terms of her or his income, and good for our bodies. And there really are some basic principles of this way of farming. One is to keep the ground covered at all times. The second is to not disturb the soil, to really reduce the plowing, and to not put chemicals on the soil that are going to be injurious. And the third is to conserve and recycle nutrients and water and so on. And then the fourth one, which is very, very key, is to diversify crops, to have a diversity of communities involved, so the social piece of this, and to diversify the way that you are growing your foods throughout the cycle of the year. And this creates healthy soil, healthy people, and healthy planet. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. First, I want to talk about how this regenerative farming and these four key principles of regenerative farming contribute to our nutrition and our food security. To do this, let's go to a farm in Sonoma that's owned by the Kaisers and learn a little bit about what they are doing on this farm and how this applies to our health. So the Kaisers were actually working in the Peace Corps in West Africa. And part of the job that they had in the Peace Corps was to bring that third revolution in agriculture, that idea of industrial agriculture and industrial seeds and using fertilizer and pesticides to the communities that they were working in order to be able to increase productivity there. But while they were there, they realized that truly what they were doing was bringing a technology there which was inappropriate, because a lot of the communities, the local indigenous communities there, had already learned how to farm and knew how to farm for centuries in a much more productive way. And that in fact, they started to realize that agricultural land around the globe that really was being farmed in this more industrial way was much less productive than really traditional lands like tropical rainforests and temperate rainforests and swamps and marshes. And that what a lot of these communities were doing was really farming in the image of nature, where they were like recreating these natural environments in their own fields with conserving resources and a diversity of seeds and keeping the ground covered, much as you might see in this tropical rainforest, one of the most productive places on the globe. So the Kaisers really started to rethink what they were doing. And when they came back to the US and started to farm here, they decided that instead of farming in that industrial way, they were going to start to try and recreate what they had seen in the rainforests and in the communities in West Africa. And this was sort of their Sonoma version of it, with lots of different seeds and involving the community and growing at a different scale throughout the seasons and keeping the ground covered, and also really using a minimum of water and external fertilizer and so on. And they plant for diversity in each row, so that basically within one calendar year, they're getting all of these fruits and vegetables. And this is an example of just one row from their farm. For example, they first would put in kale and strawberry, then they harvest that, and then they put in leeks and bok choy, and then they harvest that, and then romaine and radish, and then they harvest that, and then broccoli and red butter pepper, and then finally tatsoi and mustard. And this is just from one row in their farm. They have, you know, hundreds of different seeds that they're using throughout their farm and throughout the rows. And this gives them these beautiful farm boxes that they're able to both give to their employees and sell to their community. And this has a diversity of fruits and vegetables in it. And when you start to look at what this means for human nutrition and human health, the best marker for good human nutrition is, in fact, diversity as well. And this has been shown over and over again, that a diverse diet, as long as it's a diversity of fruits and vegetables and grains, and not a diversity of different kinds of, you know, candies, is really the best marker for what is healthful for you. And if, for example, within tomatoes, let's say, they planted a huge variety in terms of even the genetics of the tomatoes. And each kind of tomato has different levels of vitamin C and different profiles of nutrients. So that also contributes to health. On top of that, they kept the ground covered. For example, when they were done with a crop, rather than pulling out the roots of that crop, they would just clip it down to the base. And this is very, very important because it actually protects the roots in the soil. And what we're discovering, and they call this system beyond organic, but what we're discovering is that those roots actually interact with the microbes in the soil and create this whole interplay where they are scavenging nutrients, protecting the soil, and then passing those nutrients on to the next plant. And it creates this cycle of nutrition and of life, which is actually very important. So what's happening underground in terms of the nutrition is just as important as what's happening in the stems and the leaves of the plants. And we're seeing this when we start to track the nutrient density, or the levels of polyphenols and vitamin C in these plants that are grown in this regenerative system. If you look at this, the triangles looks at total ascorbic acid and polyphenols and anthocyanins in breeds of strawberries that were grown in a regenerative system as compared to organic or sort of reduced pesticide or conventional. And the top system really is following the rules that the Kaisers have used. And what we see is that you do get a little bit more nutrition in the strawberries that are grown in the system. Interestingly, it varies by genetics of strawberries. So the Strawberry Festival, which is one breed of strawberry, seemed to do much better in this regenerative system. Whereas the Florida Radiance, which was kind of optimized for a conventional system, actually didn't improve its nutrition. And we find this over and over again in different studies. This is a study of onions, two different kinds of onions that were grown in Ireland, and they were grown in conventional versus organic systems. But the organic practices, if you look, were not just basic organic. They were actually more regenerative, with rotation of crops and reduced tillage. And they also, in terms of pesticide use, use these very natural systems of pesticides. And when they looked at the nutrition, when they looked at the bacteria and fungi that were in those soils, what they found was that there were much more bacteria and fungi in the organic soils, especially when they used an organic pesticide systems. So the life in the soil was much higher. And then when they looked at the nutrition in these two types of onions, what they found was that in the first year of comparing them, that actually the bulbs in the conventional system were bigger than the bulbs in the organic system. And that the nutrition difference between organic and conventional was really not that different. But by the 6th year of growing, the red barren bulbs were much bigger in the organic system than they were in the conventional system. So as the soil life took off, so did the yield for some of these plants, and the nutrition also became much more significant. The antioxidant capacity in the organic system. And this was much more significant for the red barren, so for the red onions, than it was for the yellow onions. So in short, when it seems that healthy soil where you get all these microbes going, plus specific kinds of seeds, seems to lead to more nutrition and more food. So life in the soil really might be the next frontier in nutrition. And this is very early science. There's a lot more to discover here. Hopefully, nutritionists and soil scientists will start to team up more to ask these questions of really how it optimizing life in the phytosphere impacts our health. So the second way that soil health impacts our health is through allergy and immunity. And to talk about this, I want to go to a farm that's in the Ozarks in Missouri. And this is a farm that is actually a beef farm, a cattle farm that's run by this rancher, Cody Holmes. It's called the Rockin' H Ranch. And he is really a regenerative cattle farmer who really is trying to use cattle to improve the life of his soil. And the way he's doing that is by not using fertilizer or pesticides on his soil. And he is moving his cattle in herds, much like the bison moved through the Great Plains hundreds of years ago. He's moving them in these intense herds where they eat the grass, they put their fertilizer, which is their manure, back into the soil. They kind of stomp up and disturb the soil in something that's called punctuated disturbance. And once they have finished with one area of soil, they move on and they don't come back to that area for a whole year. And in that way, he's growing these healthy cattle, not using herbicides, pesticides, growth hormones, and so on. He's not using external feed. And he's also growing this incredibly healthy soil. But what really interested me about Cody was that he was claiming that when he started to change his farming system and to stop using all these inputs, all of the antibiotics and so on his cattle, that he stopped needing to pay vet bills. That all of a sudden the diseases that he was seeing before in his cattle, a lot of the upper respiratory diseases and gastrointestinal diseases disappeared. And his vet bills, as he said, became zero. And so this really intrigued me, how switching to healthy soil and getting rid of these inputs suddenly made his cattle so healthy. And I started to do some research on it. And I ended up really becoming convinced that it was in fact the diversity in the soil that was making the difference. And the reason I started to think this way was because I spent time with this woman, Erica von Mutius, who runs a research collaborative that's actually international, but is based in Germany, called the Gabriel Collaborative. And it actually is looking at children who are raised on sustainable farms and trying to understand why it is that they have such low rates of allergy and even of asthma and other autoimmune diseases, and atopy, which is specifically eczema. And she has been comparing them to children who are growing up in the city and their rates of asthma and allergy. And her research group has also been comparing them to children who are raised on more conventional farms where they use the conventional methods that we've already discussed, more fertilizers and antibiotics and herbicides and so on. And she really is finding that somehow these sustainable farms are protective of these children. And when I went and visited Dr. Von Mutius and asked her, what do you think on this farm is making all the difference and what is protecting these children? She went to her computer and she brought up this photograph from a Bavarian farm. And she said, this should tell you everything. This should really illustrate what is going on these farms. So what is going on here? Well, you have a baby in a bouncy seat for sure, who's really being exposed to a whole bunch of what we might call germs, both from what the mom is pitching in the air and from the cattle and the hay and the manure and the floors of the barn and presumably the soil that's made its way in there. And certainly on these farms, I know this is a touchy subject and I'm speaking to a public health audience there, but typically that milk that's over on the left side is, fresh from the cow. I'm not endorsing raw milk here at all, but that is a form of exposure that these children are having as well, that Dr. Von Mutius studied. And when she went and did a lot of culturing and took swabs from these farms and compared it to what she was collecting from her children with asthma and allergy in the cities, what she found, and this is an article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, is when it came to both bacterial and fungal diversity, kids living in the city were exposed to kind of this kind of diversity, and really not very much. It was very homogeneous. Whereas kids on the farm, both in terms of bacteria and fungi, were exposed to an enormous diversity. And these studies have been replicated in comparing the Amish to the Hutterite. It turns out that culturally they're very similar, genetically they're very similar, but in Ohio, the two communities were compared, and the kids in the Amish community had much lower rates of asthma and allergy. And it turns out that specifically in Ohio, those communities tend to use a lot fewer industrial inputs on their farms as well. So this interesting link. Can we prove causality there? No, but there's a very interesting association between low use of herbicides, pesticides, and so on, higher diversity on these farms, and a lower incidence of allergy and autoimmune disease. And this is a study that was done by Tari Hatala, who's an asthma and allergy researcher in Finland. He's been finding the same thing for eczema, that more biodiversity in terms of the environment leads to less atopy or allergy in the skin. This is one of the schemas that he has in this study, where he is really linking reduced urban contact with biodiversity to poor microbiota in our gut, to problems of imbalance and immune function, to inflammation, and to us going in more to the doctor's office and so on. And so the other interesting thing about the studies that were done by Dr. Von Mutius and her team on these farms is that the bacteria and fungi that they were culturing were not all entirely benign. This is from the New England Journal of Medicine, and you can see that Listeria was actually listed as one of the most more common species that they were finding in the farming environment. This is certainly not something that I want my patients to be exposed to, but it is ubiquitous on farms, and it probably only becomes a disease problem when it is in situations where it is allowed to flourish because it is not being counterbalanced by a large diversity of other microbes, as is the case in Dr. Von Mutius's samples from these farms. And this is a study that, this is a schema from Science Mag, but that really reproduces studies that we're finding now, that when pathogens in the soil, or for that matter in our gut, are exposed to very homogeneous microbiomes, they're allowed to flourish, versus when they are exposed to higher diversity of microbiomes, they are suppressed. And this happens in the soil microbiome, in the plant microbiome, and indeed in our own microbiome. So, am I proposing this? Maybe. or this, maybe even for adults, or maybe that we take a bunch of these from healthy soil. These are all things to consider in terms of creating that cycle of diversity. So finally, climate health. And quickly, I want to go to an egg farm that's in Oklahoma for this. This is actually two different egg farms. There's one on the left and one on the right here. The one on the left looks like that in the barn, and the one on the right where you see me, the large chicken, is a pastured system. Now, if you were to think about climate and greenhouse gases, whether it's nitrous oxide or methane or carbon dioxide. By the way, the one on the left is free range organic if you're buying those eggs in the supermarket, and the one on the right is pasture raised. I know that might be disappointing for some of you, but that's actually what free range organic generally looks like. They give them organic feed and they are free range, and they kind of have access to this little patch outdoors, but they can't find it. And I know there's a big price differential between these two eggs, but that's actually what they look like. But in terms of greenhouse gases, the eggs on the left, or the chickens on the left, their greenhouse gases are going up, and the ones on the right are actually going back into the soil. So these two farming systems really do make a difference in terms of climate health as well. In terms of food security, nutrition and mood, I also want to make an argument that the one on the right is better. In terms of food security, it turns out that when you're in the packing house, for every egg that you get there, you actually get an egg and a quarter there. Now, granted, the yield is much greater on the left in terms of total volume of eggs, but eggs per capita, or eggs per chicken, you get more on the right, because the shells tend to be higher in calcium because of the fact that they are able to get more calcium and vitamin D from the soil, and selenium and so on. So it does manifest itself in shell health. It also manifests itself in terms of the nutrient density of the egg itself. This was a study that was done from Italy that compared pastured to organic to conventional. And as you can see, for vitamin E and beta carotene and lutein and zeaxanthin, it was much higher for pasture than it was for organic. And the nutrient content of organic looked pretty similar to conventional. And that's not surprising, right, when you see the actual growing system of those two. So, you know, what's good for the climate is actually good for the chicken and the welfare of the chicken. And it's also good for our own nutrition. And these are where those nutrients work so well in our body in terms of brain health and health of our, you know, visual system, visual cortex, and so on. So it all marches through. Good for the farmer, good for the chicken, good for the planet, good for our bodies. And this is some interesting research showing that there are actually microbes in soil that can get into our gut and into our respiratory system and interact with our own microbiome, and actually through the gut-brain axis might impact our mood and our own serotonin levels. This is a study that was done on M. vacca, which is one specific microbe, but it showed that in fact, when gardeners and people in general, patients were exposed to this microbe, that they registered a more positive mood and so on. This has led me to think that when farmers are getting down on their knees and examining their soil, they're actually doing psychotherapy. So what healthy soil does for you: it nourishes you, it protects you, it uplifts you. And here is the sad part, that when you look at a map of our country, really only about 4 to 10% of what we're doing in this country would constitute as healthy agriculture. Only 4% of what we're growing nationally is fruits, vegetables, or nuts. Only 4% of what we're doing is cover cropped, although that's changed a little bit in the past year, and it's closer to 10% now. There is some real progress going on there. Less than 1% is in fact organic in terms of what we're growing. Even though 10% of the market share is organic, only less than 1% of what we're growing nationally is organic. And only about 10% is no-till, and no-till is no plow. And remember, we were talking about how plowing is really not good for the soil or for our own nutrition or for the air or what have you. So we have a lot of room for improvement in terms of making our land in this country look like land that should be good for our health. In terms of your work, I would love for you to think about the 3 Ps. The first is patient advice, or it might just be your own advice to yourself if you're not working with patients. The second is policy, and the third is procurement. And I know a lot of you are probably involved with procurement. So in terms of advice, when I talk to patients or clients or friends or communities, I tell them to really think about eating from farms with healthy soil. And now you know what healthy soil looks like. It's soil where they use cover crops, where they plant rotations, where they really have a diversity, where they don't till, and where they use a minimal of chemicals. And does this mean organic? Sometimes. I visited farms like that picture of that farm I showed you, the carrot farm, where the nutrients in the soil were washing away in the Central Valley. That was an organic farm, but they were not practicing this way. So I've visited organic farms where they're not practicing the principles of soil health, and I've visited farms that are not organic where they are. Eat a diversity of fruits and vegetables. Think about pasture raised and rotational grazing, because that's not only good in terms of the animal products, should you eat them, but it also is good for the soil. And my belief about growing animals is that you should use them to grow vegetables, and grow them in an ethical way so that you then can use that land to grow fruits and vegetables that are in soil that has been fertilized by those animals. Grow your own fruits and vegetables whenever possible, and get exposed to farms and to nature, because we know that direct exposure is good for your health. In terms of policy, this is all too often what happens to agricultural fields in this country. Because a lot of big farmers are protected by crop insurance, there's little incentive to keep the soil healthy and draining, which is what happens when you protect soil health, and with a cover crops and with a diversity of fruits and vegetables. So you might want to learn more about crop insurance and how the advocating for changes there might actually promote healthier soil and healthy people. On a California level, SB 1383 is coming up for vote, and this is actually a really it's starting to be implemented, and you might want to find out more about this, because while this focuses a lot on reducing waste and recycling and so on, it also focuses on compost and soil health and water conservation and putting money into the pockets of farmers. So that is a local initiative that might interest you. I also want to say that on a national level, farmers are really becoming much more engaged in this issue. This is an interesting article that appeared in Politico. Oh gosh, I didn't put the date, in December. But how a closed door meeting shows farmers are waking up on climate change. You might want to download this and read it. It's really interesting. More local legislation. This is an example of something I think from Maryland, where they started to require that a certain amount of what happens in vending machines is local food. And so all of a sudden they had to make things that would work in vending machines that were local, and that was as a result of policy and legislation. And so here you have local farm fruits and vegetables being sold in vending machines. Here's a San Diego law that said you could remove your lawns and start putting and get subsidized to start putting food in your front lawns. These kinds of things are incredibly valuable for the planet and for our own health. In terms of purchasing, we know that advocating for local purchasing or regional purchasing through organizations like the Good Food Purchasing Program that we have here in Northern California and that UCs are involved in, this is really, really an important way to start to change what's happening on farms and change our own health. And this involves schools and food assistance programs and hospitals and restaurants and private cafeterias. And any of you who are involved in this really should advocate for healthy soil. You have an enormous amount of purchasing power. $140 billion are spent through institutions each year on food in this country. And that could really change what our farms look like if you put that to good use. And finally, to close, I really encourage all of you to become soil health ambassadors. And in order to do this, you're going to need a couple things. First, here's your soil health kit. And you're going to need, I guess, three things. One is to know the principles of healthy soil and to be able to go around and advocate for these. So just a quick reminder to keep the ground covered, to not disturb, to conserve and recycle, and that diversity, diversity, diversity. And I really try to think of this as both cultural diversity in our communities and in the soil. We need that in order to grow healthy farms. Second thing you're going to need is a bunch of washed, non-dyed tidy whities or underwear. And what you're going to go around and do is actually plant those and start doing the Soil Your Undies test, where you're going to find the healthiest soil you can, and you're going to plant these one pair of undies flat, an inch to 3 inches below the surface, just with the waistband sticking out. And you're going to plant a control pair of undies in the least healthy soil you can find, something that's like, in some monocrop or pesticide lawn somewhere. And then you're going to leave them each in there for a month or two and dig them up and compare what you find. This is what I found when I planted one in my biodynamic garden and the other one in my yucky gravel-covered walkway. And what this is going to show is all the microbes that are there in that healthy soil. And you can use this as a demonstration for how powerful those microbes are, how much work they're doing, not just in terms of digesting the cellulose in those tidy whities, but in terms of digesting the nutrients that we need in our soil. And finally, in your ambassador kit, you're going to have a series of these slides that you can capture from this talk. One shows a cross-section of skin and our cross-section of our soil. And you can see both in form and function, they really are very similar. The microbes work in the same way. The way that they actually harvest nutrients and push them across the strata is the same. And even the hair and the grass work in the same way, and the glands and so on. The same with a cross-section of gut and a cross-section of soil. This is the roots of a plant and the vascular system of our kidneys. And you can see that these are actually, you can't tell them apart. Do you know which is which? No, because they actually work in a very similar way in terms of nutrients and how they transport those nutrients. And this is because nature is incredibly thrifty, and when she comes up with a good design, she does it over and over and over again. And finally, on an electron microscope level, you can't tell which is the roots of plants interacting with microbes and which is the villi of our intestine interacting with microbes. And this is because, in fact, we are soil. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for that presentation. If anybody has any other questions, if you can add them to the Q&A box now, and then I'm going to start posing some of the questions that have already been asked to Dr. Miller. The first question that I have is, how do the Kaisers keep the soil healthy if they are constantly using the soil by turning over crops?
So hopefully I answered that by the time I got to the end of their presentation. They are actually leaving the roots in place. So they're putting in new vegetable starts on top of old roots. And even though this is a boutique little farm in Sonoma, this is actually the same soil health principle that regenerative farmers who are now farming many thousands of acres, like, you know, in Oklahoma and Kansas and so on, are also using, where they basically use something called a roller crimper to mow down one crop, and then they're using something called a no-till drill to plant in the next season's crops. And so by not disturbing what's happening underground, they're constantly adding nutrition to the soil through the green matter or the plants that are on top. Now, what's happening on these big farms is a little bit controversial, because they are still, a lot of these farmers are still using herbicides, and specifically the herbicide glyphosate, to kill off one crop so that those seeds don't refertilize before they plant the next. But there are organic no-till farmers that really are starting to innovate and not use the herbicides anymore, and are really able to do these soil conservation methods. And what they're finding is that their soil organic matter goes up each year, as does the fungal and bacterial populations in the soil, as does the yield of their crops, as does the amount of water that they're able to conserve.
Thank you so much for that. We're getting short on time, so I'm going to get a couple short questions out. One viewer asked if the slides on corn refer to feed corn or sweet corn.
That slide, there's a number of slides on corn. The slides on corn represent all corn, but feed corn is a tiny percentage of the corn that we grow in this, not tiny actually, I think but less than 50% of the corn that we grow in this country. And most of the corn that we grow for humans actually goes in to industrial processing, into, you know, high fructose corn syrup, and, you know, a lot of the, you know, highly processed corn that ends up in fast food and so on. Very little of it ends up on lovely sweet corn on your plate in August.
Great, thank you. Another viewer asked if there's any research on pollinator or bee health with respect to soil management approaches.
Yes, there's a ton. Well, first of all, we know that pollinator health is incredibly important just for yield and also for the nutrition of plants, and that both go down when you don't have pollinators. Even if it is an open pollinating or self-pollinating plant, such as a soybean, you actually lose yield when you don't have pollinators. But at the same time, it is really obvious that pollinators are there for other purposes as well. They tend to be in competition with pests that we don't want in our crops, because they destroy our crops. And so when you don't have the pollinators, you tend to have more of the pests. So they play lots of important roles, both as terms of beneficial competitive insects, but also in their active pollinating roles.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we are at the end of the time for our webinar, but I wanted to thank you, Dr. Miller, for answering so many questions. And we will try to get some of the resources mentioned on this webinar today onto our website.
Absolutely. And I would love to open the dialogue with all of you, because I think that this is such an incredibly exciting frontier in human health. And we need to all dive in deeper, and it's going to require real transdisciplinary collaboration to do this.
Thank you. And before we close, I want to take a moment to introduce Kim Guess, a dietitian with the Be Well at Work Wellness Program at UC Berkeley, who would like to share a little more about what her program is doing to incorporate sustainability and well-being on campus. Kim?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It's a little quiet, but we can hear you.
Faculty and staff.
Hi, Kim. I think you muted yourself. If you could start over one more time.
You know?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. So our theme this semester is Sustain Your Well-Being, and this webinar was one of our offerings that fits into that theme. And our next opportunity is going to be this Friday, when our volunteers will be gathering at our new staff garden on campus to do some weeding. So maintaining the garden ourselves reduces the need for pesticides and herbicides on campus, but may also relieve stress, boost your mood, maybe because of those microbes, and provides a source of community. So if you're interested, you can visit our website, uhs.berkeley.edu/staffgarden, to learn more about the garden and how to join us.
Thank you so much, Kim and Dr. Miller, as well as to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. COEH hosts an occupational health and safety webinar the first Wednesday of every month from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific. We're excited to announce the launch of an industrial hygiene webinar series in cooperation with the NIOSH ERCs throughout the country. These will take place the second Tuesday of every month. This new industrial hygiene series will be in addition to our NIOSH ERC ergonomics webinar series, which takes place the third Wednesday of every month. All of these webinars will be available for continuing education credits. Be sure to check out our website for more information and register at coeh.berkeley.edu. Thank you again for all of your wonderful questions and participation in today's webinar. Have a great rest of your day.